It's a story about how people perform under pressure, and it's a story about the enduring importance of problem solving in an age of increasing automation. This is the story of Vueling Flight 2220. When 150 passengers boarded an Airbus A320 operated by Spanish low-cost airline Vueling in Barcelona, Spain, they were bound for Seville, just an hour to the southwest. Many of the passengers were tourists visiting the historic Andalusian city. Others were traveling to see family or returning home from working or studying in Barcelona. Up front in the cockpit was a crew of three, a captain and two co-pilots. It was the crew's third flight of the day. Earlier, they had flown to Rome and back. The captain was a 47-year-old Frenchman with more than 10,000 hours of flying time. He was also very familiar with the Airbus A320, having accumulated over 4,000 hours on the aircraft. This experience would prove invaluable on this flight. On this flight, the captain was training a new first officer, a 42-year-old Spaniard who was relatively new to flying. The trainee first officer had less than 1,000 hours of total flying time, of which only 90 hours were on the A320. In fact, most of his A320 hours had been accumulated in the last 30 days. Because of the reduced safety margin with an inexperienced pilot at the controls, there was a third pilot in the jump seat for this flight. He was 33 years old and had almost 6,000 flying hours, about half of them on the A320. He had also worked as a test pilot for his two previous airlines and was a graduate of NTPS, the only civilian test pilot school in the United States. His job on this flight would be to supervise the new co-pilot and keep an eye on the big picture in case the captain's attention became too focused on training the new first officer. He would also need to be ready to step in if anything went wrong. Just before 7 p.m. that evening, Flight 2220 pushed back from the gate at Barcelona's Terminal 1 and the pilots began taxiing to the runway. It was a sunny day in northeastern Spain and conditions were perfect for flying. The pilots didn't expect any problems as they made their way to the runway. However, it was going to be a busy trip, both because of the extra workload of training the new pilot and the fact that the flight was so short. The captain would fly the plane for this leg of the journey, with the trainee pilot acting as the pilot monitor. They would swap roles on the return to Barcelona. Shortly after 7 o'clock, the plane had reached the hold short point of the runway and air traffic control cleared it for takeoff. On the ground, the pilots steer not with the rudder, which is ineffective at low speeds, but with a tiller that directly controls the nose wheel. With his hand on the tiller, the captain lined up on the runway and then set the engines to take off thrust. From then on, he would control the aircraft using his side stick, thrust levers, and rudder pedals. Within moments, the aircraft was in the air, heading southwest towards Seville. For the first 25 minutes, everything went according to plan. The plane quickly reached its cruising altitude of flight level 350, or about 35,000 feet, and the four cabin crew members walked around the cabin serving food and drinks. The aircraft used for this flight was one of the oldest in the airline's fleet. It was now 21 years old, having rolled off the production line in 1990. In fact, it was so old that the cockpit jump seat was particularly uncomfortable. So uncomfortable, in fact, that when the plane reached cruising altitude, the backup pilot left the cockpit, preferring even the low-cost airline's passenger seats to the jump seat. As it happened, he wouldn't be there for long that day. Despite the age of this particular airframe, the A320 itself was still state-of-the-art in 2011. From a pilot's perspective, one of the real innovations was the ECAM, or Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor. This is a system that monitors the status of the aircraft and shows the pilots the functioning of key systems such as pressurization, electrical and hydraulic systems, among others. It also displays any FSE faults that occur, requiring the pilots to take action, and, crucially, even tells them how to rectify these faults where possible. ECAM made its debut in the early 1980s on Airbus's second model, the A310. It was so ahead of its time that Boeing's latest competitor to the A320, the Boeing 737 MAX, still doesn't have an equivalent system, more than 3 decades after Airbus first introduced it. But even modern aircraft are prone to problems. At 29 minutes past 7 p.m., just after entering Madrid airspace, Flight 2220 encountered its first problem of the evening. The Amber Master caution light came on in the cockpit, accompanied by an error message on the ECAM. Then the captain's primary flight display went completely blank. Needless to say, this was highly unusual. The pilots barely had time to react before another error message replaced the first. It informed the pilots that the nose wheel control system had failed. Moments later, the captain's primary flight display was restored, but the ECAM error message remained on the screen. The first question the pilots had to answer was how serious the problem was. Earlier in the day, the captain had seen a note in the aircraft's technical logbook stating that there had been problems with the nose wheel steering. So he knew it wasn't a completely new problem for the aircraft and that the airline's engineers had at least looked into it to some extent. However, there were no ECAM actions associated with it, meaning that there were no steps for the pilots to take to resolve it. But as useful as ECAM is, it's still far from the only place pilots go to see if something can be done about a problem. The captain flicked through the aircraft's crew manual and quick reference guide, looking for information on how to deal with this fault. The quick reference guide recommended resetting one of the plane's computers to clear the warning, but the captain decided against it. While he concentrated on finding a solution to the problem, he also had to consider whether it was a good idea to continue on to Seville if he couldn't fix the problem. But at that point in the flight, they were quite close to Seville. It wasn't as if the problem was a fire that would require them to land immediately. Besides, Seville was a more than adequately sized airport, so the captain decided to continue towards his destination while he worked on the problem. One change he did make, however, was to the composition of the crew. Whatever the true status of the aircraft, it would be better if the captain had someone other than a trainee to help him deal with it. He called the reserve first officer back to the cockpit, who then swapped places with the trainee. His experience as a test pilot was about to come in very handy. In fact, he had experience of steering failures. The acting first officer began to search the aircraft's minimum equipment list and the flight crew operating manual to see if there was any way to deal with the problem that the captain might have overlooked. Meanwhile, the captain sent a message to the company's maintenance department, warning them that they would have to do some work on the plane when it landed. But it dawned on him that the condition of the aircraft after landing might not be one that a simple repair job could fix. On the A320, when the nose gear steering fails, a rather counterintuitive thing happens. By design, the wheel automatically turns 90 degrees. You might think that a sideways wheel can't possibly do a very good job of being a wheel, and you'd be right. But that's the point. If the wheel were free to move as it pleased, it could end up steering the plane off the side of the runway. At least if it turned all the way to one side, there would be no tendency to roll the plane in any particular direction. It would simply remain at 90 degrees for the duration of the landing. But while this was a clever solution, it wasn't without its dangers. The pilots now had their work cut out to mitigate these dangers as best they could, 150. The passengers depended on them doing their jobs properly. After a few minutes of searching the manuals, the first officer could find nothing to help the pilot solve the nose gear problem. Whether they liked it or not, they were stuck with it. The two pilots then began the briefing for their arrival in Seville. They would be landing on runway 27, the western runway of the airport. They checked the weather there, which included a slight crosswind from the left, but otherwise conditions were good. The captain called the senior cabin member into the cockpit and told her that there was a problem with the nose landing gear, but that the landing should be normal. At least for the moment, there didn't seem to be anything major to worry about. With the briefing complete and the cabin crew aware of the problem, the pilots began their descent towards Seville. As they descended, they contacted Seville Approach Control and declared a pan-pan. This is the international standard emergency signal used by boats, ships, and aircraft to inform air traffic controllers and emergency services that the vessel situation is urgent but that there is no immediate danger to life at the moment. The captain told the controller that he probably wouldn't be able to steer the plane off the runway after landing. That was his main concern at the moment. If anything, the bigger problem was for the airport itself, which had only one runway. The controller grounded all arriving and departing flights, affecting over 1,000 passengers on other planes. At this point, despite some nervous anticipation, the pilots were in full control of the situation. But in a few minutes, as the flight approached the airport, things would go from bad to worse. As the plane descended, the captain radioed the airline's maintenance department and informed them of the problem with the nose wheel steering. This wasn't in case they could fix it now. That possibility was off the table at that point. But they needed to be aware of the problem so that when the plane landed, they could fix it as soon as possible. At 19 minutes past 8 that evening, Flight 2220 lined up with Seville's runway 27. The pilots were now moments away from finding out whether their suspicions about the landing gear were correct. The first officer lowered the gear and the crew waited. A few seconds later, the landing gear indicator lights showed 3 greens. The landing gear was down and locked. This was what the pilots expected to see, but it was still a good sign. But this relative normality didn't last long. Moments later, as the pilots extended the flaps to the 3rd position, the autopilot suddenly disconnected. Seconds later, the flight directors disappeared from the pilot's primary flight displays, and then the autothrust disconnected. The captain was now flying the aircraft manually. A warning appeared on the ECAM informing the crew that there was a problem with the nose wheel shock absorber. It had detected that there was weight on the wheels and thought the aircraft was on the ground. Fortunately, the main gear didn't feel this, but it was a sign that something was wrong with the nose gear. To free up the crew's attention for troubleshooting, they tried to reconnect the autopilot, but it didn't work. The first officer immediately realized what the problem was. A few years earlier in 2005, an Airbus A320 operated by U.S. airline JetBlue had experienced a strikingly similar incident. On that flight, the nose gear had turned completely sideways, and the aircraft had to make an emergency landing in Los Angeles. In that incident, the nature of the problem was known so far in advance that a news helicopter actually broadcast the landing live on air, meaning that thousands of people tuned in to watch the landing as it happened. Passengers on the flight itself were also able to watch the news coverage of the incident on their in-flight entertainment screens before they were switched off by the pilots. The Vueling pilots all remembered the incident well, and they wanted confirmation from the tower that their wheel had indeed turned sideways. To get this confirmation, they decided to make a low pass over the runway at an altitude of just 100 feet to give the controllers a chance to see the position of the nose wheel. The captain continued to descend towards the runway, slowing to a speed of 160 knots, almost as if he were coming in to land. When he reached 100 feet above the ground, he stopped the descent and flew steadily over the runway so that the tower could take a look. Passengers on the right-hand side of the aircraft were treated to a very unusual sight: Seville Airport passing by from 100 feet up. The tower confirmed the pilot's fears. The nose landing gear had turned a full 90 degrees to the side. The warnings they had received were not computer glitches or problems with the nose gear sensors. They were the result of a real problem that had caused the wheel to turn completely sideways. The pilots would now have to turn back and make an emergency landing on the runway. The captain began to climb the aircraft to an altitude of 2,000 feet. The approach chart the pilots were using was this one. As you can see, in the event of a missed approach, the pilots are required to make a right turn back to the runway, avoiding the city of Seville to the south. But that afternoon there was a storm cloud to the north of the airport, so the crew asked the air traffic control if they could fly south and come back that way. The last thing they needed was to have to deal with a storm cloud when their workload was already high from the emergency. This new pattern was approved by the controller. Having skirted the northern edge of the city of Seville, the captain turned south and continued to climb to 3,500 feet. Now the crew needed some time to think. They received another radar vector from air traffic control to the east and began to discuss how to bring the aircraft in and land it. For one thing, the fact that the nose was pointing to one side meant that this was not going to be the normal landing they had hoped for. In fact, it presented all sorts of dangers. If the rubber on the wheel wore out from friction with the runway, as had happened in the JetBlue incident, a fire could ignite when the metal wheel rims came into direct contact with the runway at high speed. What's more, if the wheel strut is not in its normal orientation and is subjected to more stress than normal during landing, it could collapse. causing the aircraft to slide down the runway on its nose. This threat of loss of control on the runway, combined with the added risk of fire, meant that the pilot's earlier declaration of a pan-pan was no longer appropriate. They now believed that there was a real threat to life and the integrity of the aircraft. As a result, they declared a mayday to air traffic control. They also asked if it would be possible for the fire brigade to coat the runway with a layer of foam before the aircraft landed. They hoped this would reduce the risk of a fire. The controller had to check if this was possible and said he would get back to them. With air traffic control informed of the crew's intentions, the captain had to brief the rest of his crew. He handed over control of the aircraft to the first officer and called the senior cabin crew member into the cockpit. He told her that they had a more serious problem with the landing gear than initially thought and that they would be landing in Seville in about 10 minutes. He said that 2 minutes before landing he would call out "preparation complete" twice so that she and the other cabin crew could take their seats before landing, and then 1 minute before landing he shouted "brace, brace" twice. He also mentioned the JetBlue incident and told the cabin attendant that she should expect something similar on landing and that an evacuation might be necessary. Now fully aware of the situation, the senior cabin attendant returned to her station and, together with the rest of the crew, began preparing the passengers for the emergency landing. This included ensuring that there were able-bodied people at the aircraft exits and that they knew how to open the exits in the event of an evacuation order. The captain regained control of the aircraft from the first officer, who then made an announcement to the passengers that they were making an emergency landing in Seville and that they should listen carefully to the cabin crew's instructions. With the cabin crew and passengers briefed, and air traffic control aware that this was now an emergency, the pilots were able to concentrate on how best to land the aircraft given the position of the nose wheel. Firstly, the captain decided not to use the auto brake. This automatically applies the wheel brakes on landing, and he felt that by using the manual brakes instead, he would have maximum control over how the aircraft slowed down. He also said that he would use maximum reverse thrust immediately on landing to minimize the amount of runway the plane needed to slow down. Years earlier, the JetBlue plane had used almost the entire 11,000-foot runway at Los Angeles, and that had been hailed as an incident where almost everything went right. The captain was keen to slow the plane down as quickly as possible, using every method at his disposal. When it came to the actual technique of landing, the pilots looked to the flight crew operating manual for guidance. One of the procedures mentioned for this type of emergency was that the pilot should keep the nose of the aircraft off the ground for as long as possible after touchdown. The reason for this was to minimize damage to the nose and the risk of fire, but that was about all the guidance the procedure gave the pilots. Given the seriousness of their situation, they were not satisfied with such a short procedure. So, eager to do as much as possible to keep the aircraft safe, they looked to another checklist, one that did not apply to their situation. This checklist referred to a situation where the nose gear had failed to engage. Because it was designed for a different emergency, it gave advice that contradicted that of the correct checklist. Instead of telling the pilots to keep the nose up for as long as possible, it told them to lower it sooner, while they still had enough control to lower it gently so that it wouldn't slam into the runway when the aircraft ran out of speed. This made perfect sense in a situation where the gear was not locked and therefore highly susceptible to collapse. But it made less sense in this situation, where the gear was locked in the down position and the greatest risk of damage came from the nose touching the ground sideways at high speed. But in the pressure of the moment, the pilots decided to follow the wrong checklist. They knew that the checklist did not apply to their situation, but they reasoned that it made more sense to lower the nose while they still had control of the aircraft with the rudder. Another key difference in the second checklist the pilots looked at was the advice to shut down the engines before the nose wheel touched the ground. Again, the pilots debated whether this made sense in their case. The captain's main concern was to stop the aircraft before it reached the end of the runway. He wanted to keep the engines running until the plane was almost stationary, so that he could use reverse thrust for as long as possible. So he thought it would be better to ignore this part of the checklist. What's more, he wanted to be able to use differential thrust to steer the plane in case he had trouble with the rudder, which of course meant that the engines had to be left on during the landing. In the end, the pilots agreed on a compromise. They would keep the engines running until the nose wheel touched down, then shut it down. In the cockpit of Flight 2220, a fascinating paradox was taking place, one that is only becoming more relevant as safety improves. Today, aircraft are so reliable that most pilots go through their entire careers without a major incident. The only time their ability to handle serious emergencies is tested is in the flight simulator, twice a year. And while simulators are relatively good at replicating emergencies, they are not good at replicating the psychological effects of emergencies on pilots. As a result, they can never fully prepare pilots for what it really feels like to deal with an in-flight emergency. This means that when pilots are faced with emergencies, they are expected to perform at the highest possible level in a situation for which they are, in some important respects, less prepared than ever before. Vastly improved training, particularly in the area of crew resource management, has mitigated some of this effect, but emergencies are by their very nature unpredictable, and people tend to perform worse under pressure rather than better. The very thinking skills that pilots need to use in emergencies and other abnormal situations are the ones that are most impaired by the stress and pressure of emergencies. On this flight, the pilot's use of items from an inapplicable checklist was an error resulting from this added pressure. But the significance of this was not to be realized until landing. As the pilots continued their discussions, the controller broke the bad news. The airport could not provide foam on the runway for the landing. While the pilots would have preferred foam to be available, believing it would reduce the risk of fire, this was actually a blessing in disguise. A review of the data on emergency landings with and without foam suggests that it does not significantly reduce the risk of fire, nor does it minimize structural damage to the aircraft. If anything, the use of foam on the runway can actually increase the risk by reducing the amount of foam available for firefighting and making it more difficult to control the aircraft on landing, something that was already a concern on this flight. For these reasons, fewer and fewer airports have this capability in recent years. But the Vueling pilots were unaware of this, and as far as they knew, the chances of having to carry out an evacuation had just increased. By this time, another worry had entered the picture. The first officer checked the amount of fuel on board, which was now just over 3 tons. This may sound like a lot, but the A320 consumes almost 3 times as much fuel with the gear down than with the gear up. What's more, the flight management system, which pilots normally use to estimate fuel consumption, doesn't take the position of the landing gear into account in its calculations, so the pilot couldn't trust its fuel predictions. This meant that the pilots were under even more pressure than before to get the plane down safely on the first attempt, but at the same time they were reluctant to bring the plane back in for a landing until the fire brigade was in position beside the runway and the cabin crew had confirmed that the cabin was safe. The pilots asked the controller if the fire brigade was ready. The controller confirmed that they were now waiting at the side of the runway, ready to douse the aircraft with fire retardant if necessary. Moments later, the cabin crew called the cockpit to confirm that the passenger cabin was now safe. The pilots now had everything they needed to bring the aircraft in for a landing. For the second time that evening, the captain aligned the aircraft with Seville's runway 27. In a few moments, the pilots would find out whether the various checklists they had consulted would pay off. The only problem was the nose wheel. The aircraft was handling as normal, and there was little in the cockpit to suggest that this was anything other than a normal approach and landing. But the dramatic images of the JetBlue incident were still fresh in the pilots' minds. They would not really know what happened until the nose wheel touched the ground. Would they skid off the side of the runway, collapsing the landing gear and starting a deadly fire? Or would they fail to stop in time and skid off the end of the runway, as the JetBlue plane almost did? Or would they remain on the runway, the nose wheel catching fire from the extreme friction? 400, the A320's automated voice called out, its height above the ground. 300. It counted down, the moment of truth. The captain radioed the controller one last time, reminding him that the runway would be closed as soon as they landed. Other flights bound for Seville were told to divert to nearby Hertz and Malaga airports. All eyes were on the stricken Vueling plane as it made its way in. Fire engines were in position, preparing for the worst. As the plane neared the ground, the first officer gave the order to brace for impact. The cabin crew then began to shout this repeatedly as the plane descended the last few meters to the runway. What happened next would depend entirely on how the captain managed to control the plane on touchdown. In the passenger cabin, 154 people held their breath. 2010 traveling at 30 kilometers per hour, the plane's main wheels touched down. The spoilers deployed, and the captain immediately put the engines into maximum reverse thrust and held them there while holding the nose up with the side stick. Gradually, as the aircraft slowed, he lowered the nose carefully. The nose wheel touched the ground. As the aircraft slowed to 90 knots, the rubber in the front tire immediately began to wear away. Soon the tire burst. Whether it would be worn down to the metal rim would depend on how long the aircraft continued to fly. Fortunately, the captain's use of full reverse thrust had drastically improved the plane's deceleration rate. His aggressive use of every braking technique available meant that his aircraft wouldn't even come close to the end of the runway. As the plane passed 30 knots, the captain switched off the engines. Shortly afterwards, the aircraft came to a complete stop. As expected, without power, the cockpit instruments went dark. The pilots could smell a faint odor of burning rubber, not surprisingly. But the real question was there a fire? They radioed the tower and the fire brigade, asking if there was a fire. Both confirmed there was not. Shortly before 9 o'clock, barely 10 minutes after landing, air stairs were brought to the plane, passengers were offloaded and bussed back to the terminal building. After all, they had suffered only the minor inconvenience of arriving a few minutes late. Not only did the pilots manage to stop the plane well before the end of the runway, but the only damage to the aircraft was a burst tire. The aircraft was towed off the runway at 10:10 that night, having occupied the runway for over an hour, causing 11 arriving flights to be diverted and 18 departing flights to be either delayed or canceled. The investigation carried out after the incident found that 3 independent faults had caused the nose wheel to rotate 90 degrees, one of which was electrical arcing in wire bundles as a result of inadequate maintenance. The other was a steering valve in the wrong position, also due to poor maintenance. Finally, a fault whose cause could not be found involved the landing gear lever sending incorrect gear-up commands. The final report on this incident recommended that Airbus develop a procedure specifically for this type of emergency so that pilots can be confident that their landing technique will maximize the safety of the flight. This was far from the first time this had happened, with 18 recorded incidents of the nose wheel of an A320 turning irreversibly 90 degrees to one side. What's more, 8 different causes had been identified in those 18 incidents, meaning that even if the underlying problems that caused this incident were rectified, it was highly likely that it would happen again for other reasons. If the existing documentation for dealing with this problem remained in force, there could be no guarantee that future pilots would use their judgment as to which items from which checklist to use, as the pilots of Flight 2220 had done.